Hi, I'm Nick Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me on today's City and State TV is Nicole Gelinas. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a City and State columnist. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning,
Nicole.
Nick. Thanks for having me back.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the executive budget and what's going on as it pertains to the adjustments made with the teachers' contract. So let's rewind a little bit. So I think it was maybe a week and a half ago, the mayor's having a birthday reception at Gracie Mansion. Controller Scott Stringer shows up. They have a conversation about the obligations to pay the teachers for work that they did in 2009 and 2010 that they were getting paid for in the current budget and in future years. So what went on there? Can you take us through that kind of exchange and then what came about from that exchange?
Sure, and as your viewers can probably figure out from that introduction, it's very complicated, but it's really not that complicated when you break it down into pieces. 2 weeks ago yesterday, de Blasio came out with his executive budget, and before that, what had been happening for almost 5 years was former Mayor Bloomberg had been saying, and he repeated it at his final budget presentation, the city can't afford to give teachers retroactive raises. The teachers had wanted a 4% raise for '09 and a 4% raise for 2010. Now, Bloomberg didn't handle this particularly well. He had raised expectations right around when Lehman Brothers collapsed. He didn't have a very good rhetoric with the teachers, and that's not very good. But the bottom line is that Bloomberg was right on the math. The city cannot afford retroactive raises. If you look back to 2009, city had a $2 billion operating deficit that year. In other words, it spent $2 billion more than it took in that year. 2010, same thing. We had a little bit more than a $2 billion operating deficit. So if someone wants to say we could have afforded teachers' raises, that person has to say what they would have cut out of those years' budgets or whether they would have massively raised taxes to afford these raises. So fast forward to the present. You have de Blasio, the new mayor, saying, you know what, we can afford teachers' raises, but it's not true that we can afford them, and the proof is in de Blasio's budget. The way that the mayor proposes to afford this $4.3 billion worth of retroactive raises is to push the payments so far into the future that they go into the next elected mayor's term. Teachers will get their first payment for this work that they did 5 years ago in 2015. They won't get the last payment until 2020. So very simple, we can't afford it. And the way you can know we can't afford it is we're not paying for it. We're saying we're going to push this problem until it's future people's problem and how they're going to pay for raises for work that happened 5 years ago.
Right, and Controller Stringer's point, as I understand it, was that as just a basic accounting practice, that is completely out of whack, right?
Yes, to a degree, and not a degree that's not great enough. And this is where it does get a little bit complicated. What the city's controller, an independent elected official who was there to keep an eye on the city's finances, what Stringer said was the mayor is not accounting for some of this in a proper manner. The city has to recognize expenses when it takes on those expenses. So, to put that in a simple way, say that I hire you to paint my house and I say, look, I don't have any money right now, so I'm going to pay you starting next year and over the next 5 years. And you say yes to that, although that may not be wise. Right. So you have already done the work. I'm your debtor. Mm-hmm. I'm borrowing money from you. But if I were to say, in my personal life, how much money did I spend this year? How much money did I bring in? I should include that in current year spending and say, you know what, I need to do something. I can't afford to have my house painted. I'm either spending too much money or I'm not making enough money. I shouldn't say that spending that I shouldn't count until the future. And that's essentially what the mayor is saying, that he doesn't want to count this spending until the future. What Stringer said was, we have to take a little bit of this spending, just the $725 million for people who are going to retire very soon, and we have to bring that onto the current year budget. And Stringer is correct to say that. These people are most certainly retiring over the next few years. The city has to make these payments to these people, and so it should account for them now. The problem is with the rest of the retroactive pay, the other $3.7 billion worth, once you've subtracted the $725 million, that should also be on the current year's budget because the work has been done. The only thing the teachers need to do to get these payments is to not quit or not be fired, but it's a economic certainty that most teachers won't quit or be fired, and therefore the city knows it has to make these very certain payments for past work that's already been done. There's really no good argument, and no one has made a good argument, why it's okay for the city to effectively borrow from the teachers to push these past obligations into the future.
Right. And I understand, I mean, you wrote a piece with Fred Siegel kind of exploring the historical context of the implications of that. Can you kind of go through, I guess, looking back towards the 70s and the fiscal crisis, how that relates to the present day?
Sure. It's very worrisome because how did the city get itself in so much trouble starting in the late 1960s, early 1970s? So this culminated in the city defaulting on some debt obligations in 1975, almost having to declare bankruptcy before the state and the federal government stepped in back then. Well, the reason the city got in trouble was because it was borrowing to pay operating expenses. In other words, as Fred pointed out in our piece, Mayor Wagner back in the 60s had said, we're not going to let our fiscal constraints get in the way of the social and political goals that we want to achieve. In other words, we're going to spend more than we take in. And they did that by going out and borrowing from the city's banks to pay for their current expenses. And that is whether one wants to spend more, one wants to give the teachers a raise, we want to spend more on pre-K and so forth. That's a separate decision than saying we're going to pretend that we can pay for it when we can't. And so it's a very bad sign that we're going back to that. The city is essentially saying, although not in so many words, look, Bloomberg was right. We can't afford these raises, but let's not worry about that. Let's worry about it next year, and we'll worry about it until 2020. It's not a very good sign. If we want to give the teachers a raise, we should say right now, we're going to pay for this now, whether it's through massively cutting spending somewhere else or massively increasing taxes. And let's see, does the public want to do those things, or would the public rather see us achieve some reforms with the public sector workforce? And having that debate is fine. There are different issues with the different outcomes, but the one thing we shouldn't be doing is saying, hey, let's pretend we can afford to do this when we can't.
Right. And the $725 million that Stringer wants to put back in this year's budget, what is the overall implications for this year's budget in terms of like what that means? Does that mean that other areas will have to be slashed to kind of pay to supplement that additional money, or what is the, I guess, could you kind of give us a big picture view of what that means for the budget?
Well, the short story is nothing's going to have to be slashed or cut. And why is that? Yesterday, the mayor's staff came out and they released a new budget. In other words, the budget that the mayor presented 2 weeks ago, it had to be revised because of this accounting change. And what happened, they're bringing this $725 million into this year's budget. That doesn't create an immediate crisis because one of the reasons is Bloomberg had conservatively estimated revenues. So because Wall Street is continuing to do well, the economy is doing well, we're getting $1.2 billion more in tax revenues than the city had expected. So those tax revenues pretty much cover the cost of this higher spending. The problem is that if you look at the future year deficits, Bloomberg left behind about $2 billion worth of deficits for the next 3 years. In other words, the budget de Blasio has to put together next year and the 2 years after that. Now, because of this teachers deal and the other labor deals that will be patterned on it, those deficits are no longer $2 billion. When de Blasio presented his budget 2 weeks ago, they had gone up to $7.4 billion. That's after all of the healthcare savings. Now those budgets are $7.6 billion. So we've increased the deficit by $200 million. Why is that? It's actually a good sign. It's because we're being a little bit honest about those costs. This $200 million had been kicked so far into the future, it was off this 4-year financial plan. Now, a little bit of that spending is incorporated into the plan. The problem is the rest of it is not. We're still kicking a tremendous amount of spending for past operating expenses to make it the future mayor's problem, or a future mayor, whether it's this elected mayor or another one. We have an election, the budget goes beyond that election.
Right. Interesting. Now, on the healthcare savings aspect, there was an article in DNA Info, I think a couple days ago, and you were quoted in it actually, about the city trying to kind of weed out health insurance fraud with the public sector as a way to achieve some savings in healthcare costs, and I believe the number they're trying to hit is $100 million. Is this a prudent practice for them to try to achieve savings, or I think you were quoted as saying this is something they should be doing anyway, trying to root out fraud in the public sector?
Sure, and Colby did some very good reporting on that. It is good for the city to try to go through the rules and see who doesn't belong on health insurance, either because they've gotten a divorce so that they're no longer able to be on this particular family plan. But this is something they should be doing on an ongoing basis. It's good that they want to achieve this $3.4 billion worth of healthcare savings over the term of the contracts. But healthcare costs will still go up even with these savings accounted for. The city workforce, the city still pays for retirees' Medicare premiums, something that virtually no employer does. The city workforce doesn't pay for its own healthcare premium for the basic plan. So these are things that the mayor is still trying to say, we can have everything. We can have raises, we can have health insurance that nobody has to pay for, and we don't have to have layoffs or tax hikes. At some point, someone has to give up something, and it would be better to start talking about that now rather than a few years from now.
Interesting. And I guess we haven't seen a copy of the contract yet, and so the mayor has answered some questions about the budget, and some answers he's kind of artfully dodged. I mean, is transparency kind of an issue with kind of understanding the full implications and the big picture of what's going on with the budget and the teacher's contract? I mean, you know, would a real copy of the contracts kind of help clarify some of these questions?
Yeah, I think it would help. We do have some documents, and what they say isn't very comforting. For example, the head of the teachers union, Michael Mulgrew, he has in an informal, 4-page, what does the contract mean to you for his teachers? And it says right there in writing, for the retroactive pay for 09 and 010, you will get all the pay you are entitled to. So Mulgrew's out there saying this is retroactive pay in the past, and you are already entitled to it. It's not in the future tense. You will be entitled to it if you do something. So you've got the head of the teachers union out there saying this is past pay, you are entitled to it. But then in their longer, more legal memorandum of understanding with the city, they don't use the word retroactive, and they don't use this language that it's in the past. They call it like a restructured agreement stemming from 2009, not that it's pay for 2009. So it's never a good sign from an accounting perspective if you're telling two different audiences two different things. In other words, they're telling the teachers, it's your retroactive pay. They're telling the accountants, no, it's not, it's in the future, because they still have to be employed. So which is it? Is it in the past, meaning we should pay for it now? Or is it in the future, meaning the other unions should consider it as part of future bargaining, not past bargaining? You can't have both these things. It has to be one or the other.
Right. So I guess kind of to wrap up, I mean, with all of this in mind that we've just talked about, can we really call this a balanced budget? I mean, is that kind of a misnomer in this case?
No, we can't call it a balanced budget. It is a misnomer. The budget pushes $3.7 billion worth of spending for past work done into the future. There's no real way to call that a balanced budget. If we were to account for this, we'd have to account for it in this budget. And then, since we don't have this money, we'd have to borrow for it, which is not allowed. The State Financial Control Board, which was created in the 1970s, still exists. They're supposed to look at the budget every year and say, is there an operating deficit? Are they borrowing for operating expenses? And there's really no way around it. They're doing both of these things.
Interesting. Nicole Gelinas, this senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and City and State columnist. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and anyone who was willing to sit down and digest all of that really deserves some kind of reward.
Well, I mean, we kind of cover the same the same areas, so this is obviously informative for me talking to you as much as it is to just follow the issues through the news. So I appreciate you coming by.
Likewise.